The reach of Russian interference in Europe has taken another step with the news of Moscow turning migrants into a human weapon to destabilise neighbouring states. Finland is the example for this apropos feature. Finland's 830-kilometre land border with Russia is now officially closed after a sharp influx of migrants last year, some 1,300, according to the Finnish border guard data. Now, Moscow is denying weaponising migrants. Here at France 24, Tom Canetti takes up the story.
Helsinki has accused Moscow of instrumentalising migrants by sending them across the border, an ongoing issue for the right-wing government's political agenda. It now wants to strengthen its powers over migration. Although temporary, the proposed law would defy some of Finland's human rights responsibilities towards asylum seekers. But the Prime Minister says the situation is exceptional and Finland will try to respect national and EU rules.
We have been working to find a solution that respects our EU and international obligations as much as possible. However, we see that these obligations leave some margin in case of the national security. We need to put our national security and the security of EU countries first.
The law would mean only asylum seekers who qualify for special protection would be let in. Those could include women and children or people with disability, and their eligibility would be dependent on guards' assessment on the border. Those who don't qualify would be expelled in the first instance by verbal order, then by force if necessary. Finland closed its land border crossings with Russia last December after a surge of migrants. It extended the closure several times before announcing in April that it would remain shut indefinitely. Relations between the two countries have worsened since Finland joined NATO last year, following the invasion of Ukraine.
Tom Canetti with that report. Let's go straight to Andrew Geddes, who's from the Migration Policy Centre, joining us live. Andrew, thank you for being with us on France 24. What's your take on the situation we've just described there in our report?
Well, what I think we're seeing is the potential for migration to be a destabilising factor in both domestic and international politics. So we're in the run-up to European Parliament elections. We know that migration is increasing in importance across the European Union, could well determine people's vote. And I suspect both the kind of a fear or concern about migration is one way that influence by hostile powers could be exerted, as well as actual movement. So I think around this story is both the concern and fear that can be whipped up by the potential for migration, and of course also the very real issues that we see in the border. So this is it's been quite a significant EU concern, and only recently EU member states did agree on a legal measure for what they call the instrumentalisation of migration, or what could also be called the weaponisation of migration, but that's unlikely to take effect for a couple of years.
In terms of Moscow, the Kremlin's denial of instrumentalisation or weaponisation of migrants, are we being naive if we believe that?
Well, we have to look at the track record. We know that there were tensions at the border between Belarus and Poland. So, and we know that Belarus is essentially very likely to be pursuing the interests of Russia. We also know that Russia has a keen interest in the outcomes of European elections and in European politics. And we also know that it's been associated with campaigns of disinformation and misinformation. So as I said a few moments ago, I think that both the concern that these kind of issues can whip up amongst the general public, as well as what probably are, in the great scheme of things, relatively small numbers of people at the borders. But I think that the Russians would be aware of the potential for migration to be a destabilising issue.
Indeed, and obviously it plays into the kind of policies, the kind of tract that you hear from the mouths of the far right across Europe.
Well, I think that's an issue that external observers of European politics will be very aware. We know that the importance of a migration issue has been increasing across the EU, and if it increases importance, then radical right and populist anti-immigration parties are likely to do well. We also know that some of the leaders of those parties are more likely to be pro-Russian. So there have been reports over a number of years of ties between radical right and far right parties and Russia. some of which has been contested, but it's certainly been an issue, and allegations have been present for a number of years.
Indeed, far-right National Rally, or before that National Front in France, had a debt of some 6 million euros to Russia, which it has since paid back to a bank close to Vladimir Putin, just clarifying that one. But there are people like Viktor Orban of Hungary, who openly is a supporter of Vladimir Putin and would equally throw back every migrant that turns up. One of these issues has been countries in Europe pushing back migrants rather than accepting. This is a big issue. What can the EU do to help this situation?
Well, what the EU has done, and this has been over the last few months, has reached agreement on 10 legislative measures which form what it calls the Pact on Migration and Asylum. And this was seen as a really significant development by EU leaders, trying to put in place common procedures at European borders, and also trying to put in place measures to share responsibility between member states. So these legislative measures, there's political agreement on them, but they now need to be implemented. And I think there's going to be tension around implementation, because one of the leaders you just referred to, Viktor Orban, has made it very clear that he's absolutely opposed to the sharing of responsibility. If that means relocating asylum applicants around the European Union, he's made it clear that he would not participate in those kind of schemes. So while we do have political agreement, there is still tension between member states, which I think will affect the implementation of these measures.
Can I take you back to the Finnish border? 830 kilometres, closed in December. One wonders how migrants actually get that far north. I know, obviously, where there's a will, there's a way, and where there's desperation, people will do things that need to be done. Is there any sense that Russia's been helping the migrants to get there?
Well, I think all we can go on at this stage is reports. And so there are reports that people have been facilitated in their journeys towards the border, as was also the case in Belarus. We don't have confirmation of that, but there are reports. And obviously, it's very difficult to corroborate these reports because of the situation in Russia and the restrictions that would be. I think what we could say at this stage is there would be significant suspicions, precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, the distances involved.
Indeed, and what you're saying reinforces something from a source that I cannot name, but it is a Syrian refugee who told me that her husband had made her way to the border under those circumstances, aided and abetted by the authorities within the country. So you're very much underlining what we thought was happening. Russia's influence, though, Andrew, and you've highlighted this very clearly, is massive and it's very insidious, the way it is getting inside people's brains in many ways via the internet. In places like Africa, though, it's far more about presence and about enforcing things. I'm thinking of presence in places like Mali, Burkina Faso, where there are military junta that have called in, say, the Wagner mercenaries to, in their view, help them sort out the country and secure the country. But in fact, it's probably pushing more people to leave in some way, shape or form. And also the issue recently in Tunisia, where Tunisia was due to sign an accord with Italy, the so-called Mate plan, which Giorgia Meloni had been negotiating on 4 separate visits to Tunisia. And all of a sudden, Tunisia's president does an about-turn and signs up with Russia in some shape or form. This kind of thing is causing many, many problems, which are all leading towards more people coming to Europe.
Well, I think it's this kind of debate about migration in Africa, it's, as you rightly point out, is hugely significant. And there are significant tensions between external powers intervening in African politics. So if we rewind a little bit and look at some of the developments in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the developments you referred to in Tunisia, there are already tensions with EU leaders. So I think African governments have not been happy with the direction of travel of EU policy. There's been some opposition to domestic politics in African countries, to them being seen as merely tools or servants of EU policy. And so there were significant problems with the relationships already. But as you point out, now Europe is on the back foot in African countries. There's been significant government changes which have undermined the ability of the EU member states to achieve what it sees as its objectives in Africa. And we've already experienced allegations that migrants are being moved towards the European Union. Again, I think that could be, in a sense, that the fear or concern about such movement can also be functional and can play a part in stirring up concern in European countries. So I think that we're seeing on your southern borders, perhaps on a much bigger scale, some of the similar issues we're seeing on the Finnish border.
And all this, of course, has been put into a framework by what happened with the Syrian war and the number of migrants that came from Syria because of that. From 2011 onwards, some 3 million, depending on whose estimate you read. Your figures, I'm sure, are far more accurate than the ones I'm kind of quoting. Has the Ukraine war had a similar effect, different proportion, but a similar effect?
On attitudes,
on attitudes, on people coming into Europe, on the way people are regarded?
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, because what we've done, we looked into this in quite a lot of detail over the last couple of years, and you would see that across the European Union, attitudes to displaced Ukrainians have been quite favourable. That doesn't mean there's been a similarly favourable attitude to displaced people and refugees from other parts of the world. In fact, attitudes seem to have hardened towards refugees and displaced people from other parts of the world. So the Ukrainian displacement has generally been well, people who have been displaced have been quite strongly supported, and measures were put in place immediately under what was called a temporary protection directive to give them quite extensive rights. No other displaced group has received similar treatment. So I think there is quite a strong distinction between what happened in response to large-scale Ukrainian displacement. I think around 5 million people so far have been displaced to EU member states, and as you say, displacement from Syria, where similar kind of protections and rights were not offered.
Indeed, and that is a large discrepancy to take into account. The situation, as we see it, you pointed out earlier, Andrew, about the 10-point pact on asylum that the EU put together. Finland, though, and we heard from Prime Minister Orpo just earlier, speaking in our report, calling for the EU to act further. What do you think the EU could do? I mean, it sounds to me, from what you just pointed out, there's a 10-point plan there, it's in place. It's a question of sharing things together. Some countries don't want to join in, others are happy to do so. What could the EU do?
Well, I think it's now assembled for itself after a lot of internal debate, a lot of argument, a lot of disagreement. It has what you could call a toolkit. So it has provisions which would allow for the relocation of asylum applicants, and it also has provisions for financial solidarity. It all has also put in place what it referred to as crisis or crisis-related measures, which would allow it to introduce more severe measures at the border that your report referred to, where quicker decisions could be made and people could be detained at the border for longer periods of time, and only those who are particularly vulnerable are allowed to move onto the territory of the state they're trying to enter. So I think the EU is assembling for itself a kind of toolbox of measures which are designed effectively to respond to situations of instrumentalization or crisis, and are also supposed to allow member states to kind of step up and share responsibility. And as you say, there are some member states who are fully willing to do that, and other member states who are strongly opposed to it. The ones who are strongly opposed are smaller in number, and Hungary is probably the most vocal, but they're not the only member state that would be unhappy or sceptical about these kind of solidarity measures.
Andrew Geddes of the Migration Policy Centre. We need to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, sir. We appreciate your willingness to answer all the questions and to give us your sense of how things are. Thank you very much to Andrew Geddes there from the Migration Policy Centre, our guest for Apropos. We take a short break. After that,